Hello everybody, this is Tom Smith, and this is my first recording on my new channel, Tom Smith's Comics. So I know some of you have expressed interest in me showing my comic book collection, and so I created a channel to show my comic books. I'm going to be showing comic books that are not as well known, that are not talked about as often. I like strange comics and weird comics, oddball comics, or slice of life comics, independent comics, anything that's different than the norm, non-superhero stuff. So if you're interested in that and you want to hear about some comics that you may have never heard of before, or ones that you haven't heard of enough, then you're in the right place, and I hope you enjoy this channel. I did intend to do this as a live stream for my first video, because I like the idea of live streaming so I can get feedback while I'm talking about these comics, but I didn't realize that when you create a new channel, YouTube says you have to wait 24 hours before you can do your first live stream. So I want to get started right away. And again, I don't know how often I'm going to do these videos, so, just when I feel like it. So it's not going to be like all the time or anything, but anyways, I was saying I want to get started right away, so I'm just going to make a video and I'm going to upload it, not live stream this one. And today I'm going to be talking about, by the way, it's my birthday today, so, happy birthday to me. On my first stream I created this channel on my birthday, so that's pretty exciting. But anyway, I'm going to be talking about one of my favorite comic books ever, Boris the Bear. Okay, so I've got all my Boris the Bear comics out. I'm prepared for this. This is the first issue here. And before I start showing the covers or whatnot, I'd like to take you back in time, so you can understand Boris the Bear better. I'd like to take you back in time to the mid-1980s. Now, back in the 1980s, there was something called the independent black and white comic book boom. And what happened was, there was a comic book, first of all, called Cerebus, and which was, by Dave Sim, and it was extremely, extremely popular. It started, I think, in the late 70s, and went through the, the 80s. It got more and more popular, and it was interesting because it was a comic book that was not published by Marvel or DC, and it was something that had not been seen before. Usually, do-it-yourself comics or comics published by other people other than Marvel and, the big companies, were not well known. They didn't do very well. But this comic was an exception. It showed that one person could publish his own comic book and be a success doing it. And then there were a few other small black and white companies that came up, like ElfQuest was another popular early black and white comic, Southern Knights, these ones, and they paved the way, showing that it was possible to do this. However, it didn't really catch on until, on a wide scale, until a comic book called Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles came out in the mid-1980s. Now, this comic was done by two guys, and became just a tremendous success as well. But still, there began to pop up more black and white comics during this time period, but not the deluge or whatever that was about to happen until a comic called Adolescent Radioactive Black Belt Hamsters came out in January of 1986. Now, this comic was written by Don Chin, and who is a very funny writer, by the way. I may talk about him in another video sometime. I start talking about his comic books. But it was written by Don Chin, and it was drawn by a guy named Parsonovich. At least that's the name he went by. Wasn't his real name. Anyway, this comic, Adolescent Radioactive Black Belt Hamsters, which I've got, and I get these comics out, but I want to concentrate on just Boris in this issue, after I set this up, was a very funny comic book in my opinion, and it was sort of like a parody of the Turtles. When the Turtles were supposed to be a parody to begin with of a comic called Ronin. Although I always wonder about that, how the Turtles were supposed to be a parody, because I haven't read them, but from what I've heard of them, what I've seen of the Turtles, they seem like a serious adventure, franchise. They don't really seem like satire or parody, so I'm not sure how the parody came into it. Maybe it was different at the beginning, I don't know. But anyway, Hamsters was a definite parody and inspired by the Turtles. So the adolescent radioactive black belt hamsters, tongue twister, was extremely successful knockoff of the Turtles, I guess you'd call it. And after that became successful, that's when everybody started to jump into the game. Everybody started saying, hey, the Hamsters comic was often criticized for having bad art and bad writing, but honestly, I don't think the writing was bad. I think it was absolutely hilarious, and I like the art too. I don't think the art was that bad. It was just very unusual. It was weird, But again, maybe I'll talk about that comic more another day. I think it's a great comic. I love the comic, but anyway, everybody got the idea, hey, I can create a comic book. I can get into the industry. I can be successful. I can become a millionaire overnight, right? So many people started jumping into the breach, or whatever you want to say. And throughout 1986, there were so many independent comics that were popping up. And a good deal of them were rip-offs of the Hamsters, which were rip-offs of the Turtles. If you want to say rip-offs, I don't really like that term, but using similar titles. Like there was one called Preteen Dirty Jean Kung Fu Kangaroos. There was one called Mildly Microwaved Kung Fu Gophers. I think that's what it was, or gerbils or something. And I do have these comics as well. There was one... well, there were a lot of them. I can't think of the other titles right now, but there were a whole bunch of them at the time with similar titles starring, anthropomorphic animals. There was Hamster Vice. So they didn't all have the, adjective, whatever titles, right? But they were similar comics, Hamster Vice, and which had nothing to do with the other hamster comic, by the way. There was Fish Police, which was different, actually, though. Fish Police wasn't really like the others. But there were just so many different animal comics at the time, right? Everybody trying to become successful at doing this. So there were so many that people in the industry were getting sick of it, right? And this was a speculator boom, too. So what would happen is every time a new independent black and white comic book would come out, all the speculators would buy copies of the first issue, thinking, oh, this is going to be worth so much money. I'm going to make so much money. I'm going to buy low. I'm going to sell high on this. It didn't matter what the quality of the book was like. Some of them were good. Some of them were not good at all. So anything that was a black and white comic was selling really well with its first issue, which was, again, inspiring even more people to get into the industry. So... there were a lot of critics saying, oh, we're sick of all these comics, all these similar comics, and eventually the whole thing went bust, it didn't take long. It was 1987, it took about a year and a half, and it just went bust, and people lost faith in black and white comics. It was really sad. They threw the baby out with the bathwater, as the saying goes. The good comics went out with the bad comics, and, it's sad, because... I like that time in comics history because anybody could make a comic book. So there's all these cool, strange, comics that came out during that time, as well as really bad ones. There's a lot of gems in there, too, and I have a lot of them in my collection. But anyway, getting to Boris the Bear. So Boris the Bear was an answer to the onslaught of all of these funny animal comics that were coming out. And so... the character Boris the Bear was created by a fellow named James Dean Smith. And he went to Dark Horse, or I don't know if he went to Dark Horse, they went to him, I forget all the details exactly, but a fellow that worked at Dark Horse named, let's see here, I want to make sure I get this right, Mike Richardson. This is right at the beginning of Dark Horse Comics, a new independent black and white publisher, which became a very successful one, by the way. So in the first issue, it says the story is written by Mike Richardson. Script is by Randy Stradley and James Dean Smith. Okay, so now this is important. So James Dean Smith did the artwork for Boris, and it's great artwork, incredible artwork. And the story was mostly written by Randy Stradley and Mike Richardson, I would say, who are Dark Horse guys, like big guys at Dark Horse Comics. So they got the idea, and they went to James Dean Smith and said, we want to use your creation, which he hadn't published in anything yet. Boris was just a creation he hadn't actually published yet. We want to use him to answer all these funny animal comics that are out right now, you know, to get revenge on them, to get rid of them, to annihilate these comic books. So the first issue was Boris the Bear slaughters the teenage radioactive black belt mutant ninja critters. So in this comic book, Boris here, he lives in a treehouse. Telling you about Boris, he lives in a treehouse, as you see here, and he loves to read comic books. He's a comic book collector. But he's seeing all of these comic books coming out with the, radioactive, kung fu kangaroos, gerbils, gophers, whatever. He's seeing all these comics coming out, and he's really tired of it. He's like, oh, there's too many of these types of comics, which is the way a lot of people were feeling at the time. So Boris is a teddy bear who's owned by this boy here. And his name is escaping me. His name is escaping me. But this boy, he lives with his grandfather. And his grandfather looks like Peter Cushing. Okay? And I don't want to get ahead of things because I'm going to take this one step at a time. But in this first issue, Boris decides he's going to take out all these funny animals. So he gets all, dressed up like Rambo here. And he goes after all of the comics one at a time. The first one he goes after, the first one he meets is Usagi Yojimbo. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. Who is a popular comic and supposed to be one of the better ones. But he takes him out. He kills them, right? Okay, so this first issue is a very violent issue, by the way. And Boris changes over time, so don't get the wrong idea here. But this is all done. It's funny though. The comic is funny. It's a very funny read, especially if you know the situation at the time, right? Then he goes after Cerebus, and he kills Cerebus the aardvark. So he's going after like the critically acclaimed ones, not just the ones that weren't critically acclaimed. Then he meets up with those are either the adolescent radioactive black belt hamsters or they're hamster vice. I think they're hamster vice, these ones here. But they're hamsters anyway. He even goes after the turtles. And look at that, he kills the turtles in really brutal ways. So he's just killing all these animal comics, right? Again, the script is really good, though, in this comic. The dialogue is very funny. It seems really grim and everything, but it's cartoonish. You don't take it seriously. And the story in Boris the Bear comics is really good, and it gets better as, after the first issue. This one was just a revenge issue, basically, an answer to the industry. There's Ambush Bug, which is weird that Ambush Bug is in here. If you know anything about him, that's a whole other story. And he's not from a black and white company either. He's from a big company. But here are the adolescent radioactive black belt hamsters here. So he goes after them. And there's a really funny part in here where they say something about how come we're drawn better, you know, than we usually are, is because we're not in our own book, you know. A jab there at the artwork in the hamsters book. So then he kills all the hamsters, and eventually he just, like, there's so many of them. You see, here's a page of all the different ones, and there's some weird things in here too. There's like some classic funny animal things in here, like Beanie and Cecil. There's even Don Martin back there, which just doesn't really... They're just cameos in the book. Opus the Penguin, you know. So there are other things thrown in here, not just the stuff about the independent black and white comics. There's Captain Carrot is here. Thunder Bunny is here. He just goes on a rampage, right? And then at the end, you see the Care Bears, right? And you can imagine what he does to the Care Bears. Although they don't show that. They don't show that. They just imply that. So anyway, that's the first issue. And again, it seems simplistic. It seems rather maybe juvenile in some aspects. But it's a lot better than it sounds. Like, if you read it, the dialogue is very funny. And it's witty. And it's a fun read. But you think to yourself, okay, so that's the first issue. Where can Boris go after that, right? And I think it was originally intended to be a one-shot. I'm pretty sure. But it sold extremely well because so many people were fed up in the industry. Readers and retailers, comic store owners, everybody was fed up with all these proliferation of these black and white weirdo comic books about animals, right? So it was a big seller, and it became an ongoing series. So where does Boris go from there, right? Well, in the second issue, he takes on all the robots that were around at the time. There were robot comic books and robot cartoon shows. So it's like a Transformers or whatever. And this is a lot of fun. If you like parody, if you like satire, if you like fun stories, you know, humorous stories, not taken seriously, this is an amazing comic. And the artwork gets even better. The artwork's amazing, right? So yeah, he's tired now of all the robot stuff that's out there, so he takes on the robots, as I said. Now, this thing here he has is a special, like, pen weapon. Or actually, I feel like it was called like a can opener, like a special magic can opener or something. But it was given to him. The idea is that he gets it from Jack Kirby somehow. The legendary Jack Kirby. I forget all the details, but if you want to read this to see how it happens, then you need the cosmic can opener. Is that what they call it? But anyway, they all have these great splash pages too, like double spread, splash pages to start off the stories. Oh, and also, now I told you that Boris is a comic book collector, so there are scenes where he goes to his local comic book shop, which are really fun. The comic store owner eventually doesn't want him coming in there anymore because when he comes in there, riots happen, crazy things happen, and he ends up destroying the shop. And there's his owner boy again. Like I said, he's his teddy bear. So he starts going after the robots, you see here. Some neat artwork. Real beautiful artwork in this. There's Peter. Is that his name? Is the boy's name Peter? Well, I know his grandfather looks like Peter Cushing. Like I said, like there's his grandfather there. And I believe he was definitely based on Peter Cushing. And there's his friend. You see the boy with his friend who's in it sometimes. He kind of antagonizes Boris. Sometimes the guy with the glasses here. Yeah, there's a very Peter Cushing type picture there of him. So, yeah, he goes after the robots. And he basically takes them out with this can opener. I think this was the one that was given him by Kirby. I'm not sure. Maybe it isn't. But there is a point where he gets a device from Jack Kirby. Yeah, it is. It is. Designed by Kirby, it says right here. Okay. So that's the second issue. Alright. So in the third issue, you say to yourself, okay, so he's gone after the mutant ninja animal critters. He's gone after the robots. Transformers, GoBots, Voltron, you know, all those things that were around at the time. What can he go after in the third issue? Well, he goes after superheroes. Because we all know there's always been a ton of superhero comics. So you see parodies of a lot of famous superheroes here in the third issue. So this is really cool because what happens is, oh, if I can remember again, the lawyers for like DC and Marvel, or maybe it's just Marvel, come after Boris. And they get all their superheroes, like, it's supposed to be like Marvel. Like I'm sure they don't call it that in the comic, but that's what it's supposed to be. Like Marvel gets its superheroes to come after Boris and try to beat him up. And they all believe that they're owned or created by the company, by Marvel or DC. They believe they're... Yeah, it's Marvel in this case. Okay, so they all believe they're owned and created by Marvel. They're owned by Marvel, but created by Marvel. And in this issue, Boris teaches them, he shows them that they're actually created by Jack Kirby, a lot of them. And they're like, Kirby, why is that name familiar? You know? But they've been lied to, like, well, this is the narrative in Boris the Bear, okay? I don't want to go into the details about this because it's controversial, but they've been lied to by Marvel, who's tried to get rid of Jack Kirby's name. Basically, this was a time, you have to realize this too, when this came out. This was a time when Marvel was in a lawsuit with Jack Kirby because Jack Kirby wanted his original art back, and they wouldn't give it to him. So a lot of people took Jack Kirby's side and said, Marvel, give the man's artwork back, you know? You haven't even given enough credit for, like, creating these superheroes and everything. At least give his artwork back. And then I think they gave back, like, a certain number of pages, but they said, oh, we can't find the rest of them, and it was a big mess, you know? So this is pretty much like a comment on that, if I remember correctly. So these superheroes have forgotten they're created by Kirby. But Thor, or the superhero that's supposed to be Thor in this issue, he's like, you know, Boris. They all want to beat up Boris except for Thor. And he comes to Boris, he says, Boris, this Kirby you speak of, you know, who is this person? Why is this name familiar? And he starts to listen to Boris, and Boris teaches him where he really came from. And then eventually he turns the superheroes around to his side. So that's what it's it's a touching story, you know, and it's a funny story, but it's also a touching story. So that's what happens in that one. I said I was going to talk about non-superhero comics, but of course some of these comics feature parodies of superheroes, which is, you know, sort of a different thing, right? Okay, fourth issue, we get a little bit different here. A little bit different, because in this one, Boris is the Bear of Steel. Now, besides being a satire on the Man of Steel at the time, which I think was the John Byrne Superman comics or something, besides being a parody of that, in this issue, we learned that it's not really about Superman, right? This issue. We learned that Boris is actually a robot. That's right. We've been thinking he's a teddy bear, but he was created by Peter's grandfather, if Peter's the boy's name. Or maybe Peter's the grandfather because he looks like Peter Cushing. I don't know. But anyway, the boy's grandfather, the Peter Cushing guy, is a scientist, right? And there's a whole backstory with him too. There's actually a good, backstory to these Boris the Bear comics if you want to track these down and find them. It's good storytelling and very, these stories are involving. They're very good. So it started off like with a simplistic idea, and it went on to become more than that, right? This had 2 covers, by the way, on the front and back. You see? Because the Superman comic had 2 covers that came out at the time, and that was one of the first comics to be issued with 2 covers. Except in this one, you didn't have to buy 2 separate issues to get them. They're on the same issue. So that was nice. So anyway, what I was saying is we find that Boris is a robot created by the grandfather character. He's not an actual bear. And I think he's pretty upset. Boris is pretty upset that he's not a real robot because he's thinking, oh no, I can't be one of them because, he took on the robots in the 2nd issue, you remember. So he has to come to terms with that, with being a robot. There's also this kind of thing where he has Boris has a stuffed doll of his own called Pookie, and Pookie's like a little rabbit. And what he doesn't realize is the rabbit comes to life sometimes when he's asleep. So that's a cool little thing. I don't know if that happened in this comic, but Boris made a few appearances in a comic called Dark Horse Presents. And there was a Pookie story in there where he came to life, I remember. Also, Boris is always in a fight with the neighbor's cat. The neighbor is named Margaret, I think, this girl that lives next door, and she has a cat that's always torturing Boris. The cat is always provoking Boris. And, and what the cat does is it steals Boris's nose. It takes his nose right off of him, and it runs off with his nose. So the grandfather has to keep giving Boris new noses all the time. So Boris isn't happy with that. And there are some issues where Boris gets his revenge on the cat. There's also a girl at school that the boy likes, and she looks exactly like Margaret, the next door neighbor girl, which means either that the James Dean Smith was not good at drawing women, or could only draw one. The woman he drew looked good. She looked realistic, but maybe he could only draw one type of girl. I don't know. Or I don't know, because there aren't many female characters in the comic, and it's weird that the 2 of them look the same. I'm not sure if that changed later on, but that's just a side note. Anyway, but the artwork's incredible. Like I said, the artwork's incredible. And look, there's a good shot of Boris's treehouse. Boom! The Bear of Steel. Oh yeah, and there's this other character called Wacky Squirrel. See, Wacky Squirrel, who was not created by James Dean Smith, was created by a guy named Jim Bradrick, and he got his own spin-off comic, which I have some issues of. I don't like it as much as Boris, though. It's more like Bugs Bunny type Warner Brothers kind of slapstick stuff, which I'm not into as much. I know a lot of people like that, though, but I didn't find it, like, the stories aren't as involved, or the lore isn't as big as it is with Boris. So again, we're looking at the story here. Mike Richardson, Randy Stradley are the 2 guys that wrote these stories. Story and co-script, editing, okay. And the creator and illustrator is James Dean Smith. Okay, now that's important to remember again. You'll see why eventually. But anyway, so we get the whole story about how Boris was created in this issue. And there's lots of great reading to be done in here, as well as action. You see? So Boris got more complicated as it went on, but in a very good way, a very fascinating way. It's a great comic. That guy is another neighbor up there. And so, yeah, this is a real backstory about his origin. I believe that's what it is anyway. It's been like a few months since I read all the issues again. So, forgive me if I don't remember all the details right now. Oh no, I did that right. Okay. So, in the fifth issue of Boris the Bear, Boris meets a character called the Dump Thing, which of course is a parody of the Swamp Thing. And in this issue, the Dump Thing is actually the accumulation or the collection of all the black and white independent comic books that were coming out at the time. They all, like, Boris has like been throwing them out and everything, but they keep coming back into his collection and he can't figure out why. There's one called like Breeder Boxing Bobcats, which is not a real comic, but it's a comic that Boris keeps seeing in his collection. It's a parody of all those other comics. He's like, I can't get rid of this comic. Why do they keep coming back, right? Well, all the comics get together, they form together, and they create this monster. And the monster just wants to be read. He's like, I was designed to be read. Read me, read me. And Boris is like, oh, nobody wants to read you. You know, all these comics are terrible. They're awful. Because as I said, a lot of them were bad, but there were some really good ones too. And so that's a comment on that. It's still a comment on the black and white comic explosion at the time. And it's a really good story. It's a really fun to read story. So that's what that's about. Now in the sixth issue, Boris I think becomes Bat Bear, and Wacky Squirrel, who I mentioned already, becomes like his sidekick Robin. And there's Pookie. There's his stuffed rabbit there. There's Boris' stuffed rabbit down there. And I don't remember what happens in this issue, but I'm sure it was really great, though. Because all these issues, are, especially the early ones, are really good. So that's the sixth issue. I believe... Let me check something here. There's another reason that this issue is collectible. And I think... Okay, there's some artwork here. Yes. So, there was a fan pinup page, or pinup pages in Boris sometimes, where fans could send in their artwork, right? So a fellow named Rob Liefeld, if you've ever heard of him, he became a very famous superhero comics guy in the 90s. Rob Liefeld sent in his version of Boris here. And this may be his first printed artwork. I'm not sure about that, but it might be. So, yeah, this is great stuff. I can't remember what happens in this, but he meets some sort of Joker type character as Bat Bear. So obviously this issue is a parody of Batman and Robin. The Batmite is in here. So yeah, he's taken on like the Joker pretty much. And it looks like Batman's actually in it. Or a parody of him. Very fascinating issue. Very fascinating. They're all fascinating. I love the fact that with these Boris the Bear comics, each issue has a different theme. Each issue like takes on a different aspect of the comics industry, which is really cool to me. I love satire and parody. Okay, now this one, Boris teams up with the elves from ElfQuest, or an approximation thereof. You know, a satire of them. And it turns out that one of the elves is hiding his comics through a dimensional porthole. Because he's not supposed to be reading comics. His parents don't want him reading comics or something. He's hiding them. And they end up in Boris's treehouse, which is how these comics that he throws away keep ending up back in his treehouse again. But the elves, I think their homeland is threatened by ogres and trolls and smurfs. And they get into this battle with them. So Boris, another great splash page there, see? Boris helps him in his battle. He helps the elves. And it's a pretty epic adventure. Very, very good epic adventure. So that's what happens in that one. And it's clear that, you know, they must have been a fan of the ElfQuest comics because they don't really make fun of them. They're really like the good guys in this issue. There's a funny thing with the Smurfs in this issue where, well, I don't want to give it away, but if you want to find a copy of this issue, you can read it for yourself. Okay, the 8th issue is another comment, and the final comment that Boris makes on all the funny critter comics that were still around at the time, although most of them were going out of business when the bust started happening in the industry. So you see the turtles down there, you see the adolescent radioactive black belt hamsters, you see a jackalope there, Junior Jackalope from Tales of the Jackalope, which is a comic that is not that well known. I might talk about that someday. Usagi Yojimbo or whatever, or Zatachi Walrus, the Bushido blade of the Zatachi Walrus. That might be Thunder Bunny. I don't know. Cerebus is over there. There's I forget what the snails are called. And Crow of the Bear Clan. That's that guy over there. Did you see it says Junk Titles? Black Belt Ninja Critters. So in this issue, it's like a sequel to the first issue, and it's better though because it's a more involved story. So in this issue, I believe that all the other animals are trying to get revenge on Boris, but Boris takes care of them once and for all. There were answers to this in other black and white comics of the time. For instance, there was a comic called Laugh-In Gas, which I have, published by Blackthorn, in which one entire issue was a Revenge on Boris the Bear issue, which they called him Boris the Bear in that issue. And all these animals beat him up in that one. So that was like before this, and then this was like Boris's answer to that. So it's a whole epic thing going on here in the industry. But yeah, this is a great issue. This is a really great issue. Then the 9th issue, he becomes... he teams up with G.I. Joe. So you see like a bunch of G.I. Joe characters here, like Snake Eyes and Rock and Roll and, you know, all those dudes. But it's funny because in this issue, this is a real parody of G.I. Joe. You know, G.I. Joe is supposed to be like a macho soldier guy, right? Well, in this issue, he doesn't want to be like that. He just wants to like knit and, you know, get in touch with his feminine side and stuff like that. So he comes to Boris because the army comes after him and says, you can't desert us, you know, you're a deserter, we have to take you out or whatever. So Boris protects him, you know, so that he can find his true self, which is not as this macho character he's been made out to be. That's the satire of G.I. Joe in this issue. And it continued into the 10th issue. In this issue, we exercise our right to arm bears. So it was like a two-part thing going on here. So that was a lot of fun. The 11th issue features Wally Wood's Thunder Agents. Now, Wally Wood is a famous artist who worked for EC back in the 50s and other companies. He worked for Mad. He was one of Mad's best artists. He worked for them right up to the early 60s, Mad Magazine, Mad Comic Book. He worked in a lot of other EC comics, but he also created a superhero team in the 60s called the Thunder Agents. And somehow those Thunder Agents, I guess after Wally Wood passed away, which, well, we won't get to that, but that was a sad way he passed away. You can look that up online. But after he passed away, a bunch of companies came out with their own Thunder Agents because somehow they must have fallen in the public domain or something, right? So like Solston had its own Thunder Agents book, and there was another one from another small company, and they all claimed, oh, we're the real Thunder Agents, and they were just ripping it off, basically. So in this issue, Boris the Bear takes off all the rip-offs of Wally Wood's Thunder Agents, and he does it for Wally Wood. The spirit of Wally Wood. And it's another really touching story, like the Jack Kirby one. So that's what happens in that issue. Number 12, it's like I told you, it's my birthday today. In number 12, it's Boris the Bear's birthday. So Boris is having a birthday here. I'm having a birthday looking at this comic with you. So, now, who ruined Boris's birthday party? These are like a regular cast of characters that show up in Boris the Bear comics. Now, this issue is not a parody of anything in the comics industry. It's just a really fun story about Boris's birthday party and the adventures that happen around it. But you see characters like G.I. Joseph. That's him up there. That's who I was just telling you about, right? You see Peter. Okay, so Peter is the grandfather, not the boy. There he is. You see Sergeant Flurry, who he's a parody of, is it Fury and his Howlin' Commandos or whatever, right? He's the guy I think wants to get G.I. Joseph back in the army. You see him there. Davey? Dave is the boy? I guess Dave is the boy's name. Didn't remember that. Okay, so Dave, and Steve is his buddy with the glasses. Margaret is the girl that lives next door with the cat, as you see there, and the cat's name is Rufus, right? Then you see Wacky the squirrel. This character, no, this is hard. Alright, never mind. You see the woman here, Mrs. Abbott. She's a housekeeper for Peter and Dave. And she didn't like Boris, and he was always getting into like confrontations with her. Then we have Dynamo, who I don't remember who that is, and then the Thor guy. Yeah, the guy that's supposed to be Thor, who's Boris's friend, is in this issue as well. So all the cast of characters are in here. It's really great. It's really fun. Great issue. I can't recommend it highly enough. And there's Boris as James Bond on the back there, which is pretty funny. He's got some flippers on. So the issue 12 was the last one published by Dark Horse Comics. And this was a turning point for Boris the Bear. Because what happened is James Dean Smith, the creator and artist of Boris the Bear, was not happy with the way the character was being written. He didn't want the personality of Boris to be like it was in these issues, which is a sad thing to me because these are great and they were extremely successful. Boris was a big seller. It was a really big seller. But he wanted to take his creation back. You can understand it's his creation. And he wanted to take him in a different direction. A direction closer to what he originally intended for the character. So he left Dark Horse Comics. And he took over as the writer for Boris the Bear. So Randy Stradley, Mike Richardson were no longer the writers, the Dark Horse guys. And they wish, good luck to him and everything. But he started up his own company, James Dean Smith, called Nicotat Comics. A little company, self-published, and self-published Boris the Bear. And from this time on, Boris isn't really the same. It's different. It's not bad, but in my opinion, it's not as good as it was at the first 12 issues. It started off sort of weak, and I'll talk about that, and it got better. It did get better. Mr. Smith got better at writing the comics, in my opinion, but it never regained the success that it had earlier. The sales started going down and down. But I still recommend these issues. They're still good comic books. You know, if you like Boris, you'll still like these. But, okay, so this was the next issue. This is the first issue that he self-published himself. In this issue, Boris is the Punish Bear, like the Punisher. And it's an anti-drug issue. So, that's a good thing. I'm against drugs. But it's a little heavy-handed, this issue. And to me, when I read it, it reads like a kid's comic, almost. It's a very much just say no to drugs issue. There isn't much more to the message than that. Like, there's a story about drugs, you know, in the neighborhood. Boris finds out about them. He doesn't know what drugs are. He has to do research to discover why they're bad, and then he realizes they're bad, and then he wants to take out the drug dealers and everything. But they're saying, well, is that going to help, you know, if you do that? Well, I guess that is the idea, right? Like, he's going to take out the people doing drugs, maybe, or take out the dealers. I don't know. There's this whole thing about take out the dealers or the drug users. How do you solve the problem, right? Go to the source, you know. I forget the details, so pardon me, you know, if I'm getting this a little wrong. But Boris learns about drugs, basically, and why drugs are bad in this issue. So that's really the gist of it. It's not the best issue, although I agree with the message. It wasn't. It could have been done better, I think, or more interestingly. It works as a good kid's comic, but Boris was never a kid's comic. That's the thing. You know, not really. I mean, kids could enjoy it, but it had more to it than that. Like, it wasn't, you know what I mean? But the 14th issue is also not that great, in my opinion. Although some people might disagree. The 14th issue was inspired by a cartoon by Warner Brothers, I believe. One of the Looney Tunes cartoons, I think. Maybe a Bugs Bunny one. Where Bugs Bunny, like, goes around in his surrounding and he gets involved with, you know, the things going on in the background. I don't know the details, but this is a very weird issue where the pencil that draws Boris, number 2, he becomes a character in the comic book. And he starts playing around with Boris and putting him in different situations. He keeps drawing different landscapes and everything and seeing how Boris just reacts to them. And it's a weird story. I didn't think it was particularly great, you know, but some people liked it a lot. Some people did. I guess it depends if you're a fan of the original, like, Looney Tunes cartoon or not. It didn't work for me, exactly. Now, at the same time that this was going on, Dark Horse was republishing the original issues of Boris the Bear, but they were doing them in color. And they called it Boris the Bear Instant Color Classics, of which this is the 3rd issue. I haven't been able to find the first 2. So this is just a reprint of the... They were going to reprint, I think, all the Dark Horse issues, but they only got to do the first 3 before this series was canceled. Because sales on Boris were falling off at this point. But it's really cool to see Boris in color. This is the only time you get to see him in color. So this is a reprint of the superheroes issue from the 3rd issue of Boris. I like it a lot. I love the color. So I definitely suggest these if you're a Boris the Bear fan. It's too bad more of them weren't in color, but I'll tell you something. Most of the comic books I have are in black and white. I do have a bunch of color comics too, but the majority are in black and white, just because I usually find those comics more interesting to read. But I love color when it's with a comic that I'm interested in. like color black and white, you know. It doesn't matter to me if the comic's fun to read. Okay. Now, the 15th issue of Boris the Bear is good. It actually got better again. So, James Dean Smith at this point was starting to get better at writing the stories again, in my opinion. This was a fun slice of life story. So it's about Boris like in the neighborhood and having adventures in his neighborhood and, you know, with the regular cast of characters. James Dean Smith wrote out some of the characters, but he kept a lot of them. And this is one of my favorite issues of Boris the Bear, number 15. So, this is when it starts getting good again, you see. So that was a great issue. Yeah, actually, you know, after those first couple of issues, I'm going to say that James Dean Smith did get better at writing these. And Boris became a lot more fun again. So it was just a slight downturn. Although, like I said, the Boris never regained the success it once had. This is issue 16, Adventure Day. So this issue, Boris and Dave and Steve check out a haunted house, and shenanigans occur in this haunted house. That they find the remnants of an old gambling casino, like in the basement of the house, an illegal gambling casino that, you know, had been abandoned. There's this gang of tough guys that show up once in a while called, I think, Butch and his gang or something like that, and they're always, you know, bugging Dave and Boris. But really funny stuff happens with them in the haunted house, and, you know, and that's a fun issue. I don't have number 17. That's the first issue I'm missing. I'd love to have all of them, but I don't. Number 17 I'm missing. I think it's a Black Hawk parody issue, or like Black Bear, like Black Hawk Comics. I haven't read it. But number 18 is this one. He battles the Bear Slayer. So in this one, now I remember, Boris goes to school with Dave, and one of his teachers is a science teacher, and he sees Boris and he freaks out because he's like, how is this possible? This is a robot. He says, how can this robot be talking and thinking and moving so fluidly? Like, how did your grandfather create this? And he gets so jealous of the creation that he freaks out, and he becomes the Bear Slayer. He goes after Boris the Bear. And he creates this weird robot with all these, like, wires and stuff, and to go after Boris to try to get him. And it's really funny. It's a pretty funny issue. So yeah, again, these are really good. Then, in between 18 and 19, James Dean Smith started a spin-off of Boris called Boris Adventure Magazine. In this issue, he's the Rocket Bear, like the Rocketeer. So this is a parody of the Rocketeer. I guess Boris Adventure Magazine is more like fantasy stories about Boris. That's the gist I get of it from this, than the realistic ones, such as they are, because they're not really realistic, but these are like Boris fantasies. So it's a parody of the Rocketeer, and he meets Betty and Veronica in it, which is really funny, from Archie Comics. A parody of them, of course, not really them, but a parody. But that's a good. It's a good enough issue. It's pretty cool, and I was glad to find it, because it's hard to find some of these, especially these issues. Boris Adventure Magazine did last for some more issues later on, but I haven't been able to find any of them. Some of them, well, I'll get to that later, I think. But issue 19, was the first of a trilogy, a 3-part story called Ninja Wars. And this was a little turn for Boris, because James Dean Smith wanted to experiment with the character and try a more serious story. So with the Ninja Wars, it's not as funny as the other stories are. There's some darker stuff going on, and he's fighting these ninjas and this real bad guy in it. Unfortunately, I don't have the parts 2 and 3. So I don't have issues 20 and 21. I just have the first issue. I haven't been able to find the other ones. But that's what happens there. And then after that's done, issue 22 is a really, really funny issue. Really funny issue. They look like Sonny and Cher kind of to me. Well, sort of. I mean, they don't really look like them, but I think that they're patterned after them, if I remember correctly, but not really. Like, maybe just their names are. But anyway, in this issue, yeah, they're not really like them. But in this issue, this guy's a hunter. He's a hunter, and he likes to hunt rare animals, rare game. It's really, really funny because she's his mate, right? So she's his girlfriend or his wife or whatever. She goes around with him everywhere. But what happens is, this guy's so manly, he's so macho, right? That he can just stare at a critter, stare at an animal. And it's so overcome by his macho-ness that it just drops over dead. That's what happens in this issue. It's that how funny. It's so funny, right? So he hears about Boris the Bear, and he's like, well, he's got to be like the rarest game of all because there's only one Boris the Bear in the world, right? So he decides to track down Boris. He tracks him down, and he tries his macho stare on Boris. It has no effect at all. I guess because Boris is a robot, So it has no effect at all, and he's reduced to like blubbering. He's like crying and everything. So I have no effect, and she's soothing him and say, "Oh no, it's all right, She take care of him, and it's just really funny. And then he figures out he's a robot, and I don't remember what happens after, but it's fun. It's got a pretty cool back cover too, as you can see, the lady with a tiger here. So James Dean Smith drew this back cover, so she looks different than Margaret and the girl at school that I didn't show you that Dave likes. So yeah, he's drawing different women that look different, and here too, of course, with this girl here. It's just at the beginning, I guess, he just drew two girls that look similar. But anyway, that's a fantastic issue. That's a really funny issue. And then number 23. This is the last one I have. It's not the last issue of Boris, but I haven't been able to find any of the later issues. The distribution got low, and they're just really hard to find. But Boris the Bear 23, he goes on a space adventure with these animals, and it's really interesting because it's like he forgets who he is. It's like he wakes up like in a different life, and he can't remember anything of who he was on Earth, and there's like a whole story about how he gets there and how this happened. So yeah, he teams up with these other animals, and they're like this space adventure crew, and it's pretty cool. It is pretty cool. So that's Boris the Bear. Those are my Boris the Bear comics. I know that there are later issues. There are 34 issues altogether of Boris the Bear. Just want to show that one again. It's one of my favorite ones. There are 34 issues altogether, I believe. And there's at one point where he gets involved, I think, in the Gulf War. Back when the Gulf War was going on, I think he takes on Saddam Hussein. Which I've never read that, but I think his look changes in some of the later issues too. I think Boris's look kind of changes. I'm not sure how I feel about that, but as I said, I don't have any of those later issues. I'm missing the ones between 25 and 34. And then after that, there were a few more issues of Boris Adventure magazine in the mid-90s, which I don't have. I imagine they'd be really hard to find. And then Boris just kind of disappeared. I think a revival was attempted a few years ago in the 2000s. Not too long ago, actually. I haven't seen any of those newer comics. There's only a few of them. I don't even know how many. I don't know if there's one or two, or I'm not sure. I guess I could take a look. If I go to my comic shop and see if we could find a listing. Boris the Bear. It's not even listed here. So yeah, so there's probably like 1, 2, or 3 issues of the revival. I think it was published a few years ago, and I guess that wasn't successful because there weren't any more. But anyway, Boris is a great comic book. It's one of my favorite comic books ever. I hope you've enjoyed this look at the legend of Boris the Bear. And that's all for now. This video is exactly 1 hour. Wow. I didn't plan it that way. It's just what happened. So, give me comments. Tell me how you like this. And, perhaps I'll make another video or live stream sometime. See you.